And what you're going to find out about Dr. Kane is no nonsense. He tells it like it really is. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Is that better?
Yep. Yes, sir.
We're good?
Yep.
Okay. This is entitled an economic update, so I've done a little tinkering around, extending some of the things that we've talked about in the past. And, there you go. Okay. So we're going to look at a couple of things that are talked about in the news quite a bit. We're going to talk about production, GDP. We're going to talk a little bit about employment and some labor force rates. But what I really hope to get across to you is that what the media is focusing on, I think, is the wrong thing. And so I hope as we go through here to point out to you what actually is the right thing that they should be focusing on. Okay, Bob, where do we push this? Oh. Shows green, isn't that on?
Should be. I might have to restart it.
Oh.
I'll be right back.
Okay. While we're dealing with the technical issues, let me get you up to speed on the pictures that you're going to see and the technique that is involved here. Everybody knows what a standard business cycle looks like. You've got an upward phase or an expansion phase. We're talking about GDP now, production of goods and services. For some reason, not fully understood, that peaks out. The expansion stops. That point is called the peak by the National Bureau of Economic Research. They're the ones that identify the turning points in the cycle. So they tell us when the economy has officially gone into a recession, and then they tell us when the recovery has officially begun. Although they don't have a standard list of criteria that have to be met that you could go on their website and look at. They don't have that. They get together as a group of really smart people and figure that out. Okay. So you've got the expansion, the peak, then you've got the recession, and then the trough, which is where the recovery begins, the recession ends, and the recovery begins. So this first picture here is taken, if you will, at the bottom of the trough. So you've got 4 significant recessions listed up here. The one of 1935, as you know, the Great Depression was a series of recessions, so this is the second recession. The 1975 recovery, 82 recovery, and 2009 recovery, so we have 4 different recoveries there. And the way to look at this picture is to visualize a long historical chart with each one of these recessions on it, and then you take your scissors and you cut the chart right at the trough of each one of those recessions so you can see the recovery. Are you with me? You do that on each of those sheets, and then you lay the sheets on top of one another so you can see how the recoveries compare. So by looking up here, you can see that 1935 was actually the sharpest recovery. In fact, after 15 quarters, which is where we are now, fourth quarter of 2012 would be 15 quarters of recession. After 15 quarters of recession, the Great Depression scenario saw a recovery of about 36% in production. So by 15 quarters, at this point where we are now, the economy in the 30s had recovered by 36% over the bottom. So they were up 36% from the bottom. 1975, they were up 20%. The Reagan recovery, they were up 23%. And we are up 7%. Now, to put that into perspective, If you look across these index numbers here, these are representative of percentages. So the reason why all the lines start at 100 is because whatever value production had at the bottom, the trough, that represented 100 in each of these pictures, and so you can compare them. The GDPs are different, but the percentages are the same, and that's kind of a neat thing because visually you can compare them. So the vertical distance between the horizontal line drawn through 100, and any one of those lines read off of this scale on the left would tell you about the increase in production. You can see the current situation, 2009 recovery. We are up about 7% after 15 quarters, which is very, very anemic. Compared to 82, if we were recovering today at the same pace we were in 82, the GDP would be $3.6 trillion higher than it is now. So that, if you think about the concept of opportunity cost, in order to do one thing, you have to give up something else. What the recession has cost us is this output that we have not been able to produce. And one of the minimum ways to look at that is comparing it with another recovery. So that gives you the 3.6 trillion. If you looked at the actual GDP that we had back in December of 07, which is where the trouble started, if you look at that and use that as a reference, and you assume continued growth, we're down about $5.4 trillion. So basically what it has cost us so far after 15 quarters is $5.4 trillion worth of output. Now to put that into context, everybody's familiar with the Fortune 500 companies, right? Okay. If you looked at that list, if you went down that list to about number 45, and you thought about all those huge corporations between 1 and 45, if you added those all together, the value of those companies would be equivalent to what we have lost. It is a tremendous loss in production. So it is a really serious situation. What usually drives recoveries is gross private domestic investment. There are several sectors in the economy. There is the private sector, the consumer sector, households. We're the most stable sector in the economy. Then you have the business sector, which is, we're looking at here, gross private domestic investment. You have the government sector, and then you have the foreign sector, which is net export. So this is the one that is the most volatile, and this is the one that drives the recovery. And you can see from again, these are index numbers, from the bottom of the trough. It says trough equal 100. So you can see that the most vigorous recovery in gross private domestic investment was the 1975 recovery. We were up about 62%. 1982, by this time, real gross private domestic investment, which would be building new plant and equipment and homes and apartments, that sort of thing. We were up 52%, but in our current situation, we're up 39%. So business is not responding to the situation as they have in the past by building new plants and replacing old equipment and so forth. Now, one of the possible explanations for why business investment has not recovered can be found in the notes of the AT&T annual report. How many of you read corporate reports, annual reports? How many of you get those reports? Bernie? So you're not reading them, is that it? All right. Well, for some reason, I was reading not only the pictures, but in the back there's some notes that tell you what the numbers mean. So I don't mean to bore you, but I want you to listen carefully to these two sentences from 2012's annual report. For the year ended December 31st, 2012, we decreased our discount rate by 1%. So the actuaries who work in the company and who are responsible for making sure that the promises that have been made to pensioners are able to be met by carefully investing the money that the company decides to put into that, plus employee contributions. They're the ones that have to figure out how to meet those objectives. We decreased our discount rate by 1%. So basically they're saying we have come to realize that in this low interest rate environment created by the Fed, we are no longer able to earn on the assets that we have out there in the marketplace as much as we expected to. What do you think that means for meeting future pension obligations, many of which are stated in a formula in a contract? Well, it means that you're short. What do you have to do now in order to keep from being short? You have to put aside more money, resulting in an increase in our pension plan benefit obligation of $7 billion. For the year ended December 31st, 2011, we decreased our discount rate by 0.5, resulting in an increase in our obligation of $3.4 billion. So the gist of the matter is this. If you add just the latest 3 years, $7 billion in 2010, $5.4 in 2011, $11 billion in 2012, $23.4 billion is not going into new plant equipment. It's not going into R&D because it's having to go into pension funds in order to keep them solvent. So that is one of the implications of these very low interest rates that we usually don't think about. And that's just one company. Okay, think about how many companies there are. And is it just companies that have pension obligations? No, states have pension obligations. Cities have pension obligations. And they're having to do the very same thing. Set aside more money because they're not able to earn the rate of return that they thought they would. Here are a couple of labor force rates that you don't hear much about. You hear about the unemployment rate. You know, the latest employment report showed 88,000 new jobs created. Do you remember the 1980s? I remember studying the 1980s. There were certain months, 1 month period in the 1980s, in which we created more than 1 million jobs. And we created 88,000 jobs. It is dismal. And this is part of the reason why the unemployment rate is not, you know, substantially higher than it actually is. The top line, the red line, which starts from 1975, is called the labor force participation rate. And basically, it looks at the number of people that are working, the number of people that are technically unemployed, and you remember the definition of unemployment. We've talked about this in the past. In order to be unemployed, it has nothing to do with unemployment compensation. You have to, A, not have worked during the previous 4 weeks. 2, been available for work the previous 4 weeks, so you weren't in jail and you weren't overseas. And number 3, you actively sought work during the last 4 weeks. If you answer yes to those questions, I'm unemployed, I didn't work, I am available, and I did seek work, but I was unable to find it. Only if you meet those 3 criteria are you officially unemployed. So this labor force participation rate looks at those 2 groups of people, working and unemployed, as a percent of the adults who could conceivably do that. Labor force participation rate, not including children, non-institutional population. So you can see that in 1975, the labor force participation rate was a little over 61%. 61% of adults who were physically able were participating in the labor force by either having a job or actually looking for a job vigorously. And you can see the upward trend there. The rate has drifted upward, reaching a maximum, I think, of about 67 point something or other. And that was in about the year 2000. I've got a reference line on here for you for the 2008 crash. That's when the things really started to come apart, starting at the tail end of 2007 with the collapse of the sub-mortgage portfolio. So that vertical line that you see here is our reference line for the crash, right here. And you can see that at that, just shot slightly to the left of that, you've got a pretty steep drop-off in the labor force participation rate. And that is hiding the true extent of the problem because it's not showing up in the unemployment rate. A little bit below that is the blue line, which is the employment to population ratio. What percent of our adults who are not institutionally confined are actually engaged in labor force, are actually working? I mean, not unemployed, but they're actually working. This is lower, of course, because you're eliminating the unemployed. But you can see that at the present time, the employment to population ratio is 58.6%. That's the lowest it's been since 1983. So where are these people going? You read the news. What's the story?
Disability.
Long-term unemployment benefits, when those play out, they go into disability. Not all of them, but I mean a growing percent of them. And so this decline in both the labor force participation rate and the employment to population ratio are very ominous developments because, of course, in contrast to the way the politicians look at things, that somehow it is government's job to create jobs. It's not the government's job to create jobs. Jobs are created when people with ideas of how to better meet the needs of consumers hire people to help them accomplish that objective and share in the reward from doing so. That's what creates jobs. And so one of the most disappointing things to me was for Romney to focus most of his attention on telling the people at campaign stops that he knew how to create jobs. What we need is an environment in which people can go about their business doing that, business people and entrepreneurs and so forth. And that is one of the things that is missing today. And that lack of opportunity is one of the things that you see in the downward trend here on this employment and population ratio. This chart shows that the situation is considerably worse for black Americans. You can see that in the recoveries of 75, the blue line, and the recoveries of 82, the green line, black labor force participation rate rose as the economy came out of the recession. That makes sense. It should do that. There are more opportunities. People jump on the bandwagon. If they weren't looking for work, they start looking for work again. But you notice what's happened in our situation, in our current recovery, the 2009 recovery. So we're 2% lower than we were when we started the recession. Okay? This is from the trough. This is the other two. In the other two cases, we were about 4% above. So there's a 6% gap there. And that's translating into lower incomes. This gives you a picture of what's happening for whites, which would include Hispanics in the statistics. You can see about the same picture. And you can see actually that it's a little bit lower. The decline in labor force participation rates has been a little more dramatic for whites than it is even for blacks. This shows you the path of employment, both total and private employment. And there is, you'll notice the word peak there in the chart. Peak. So the zero here in this particular case starts at the peak. In other words, once the economy turns down, we're looking at the whole thing, from when it turned down through the trough up into the recovery. So that whole period of time is what we're seeing here. You can see that the behavior of both total employment and private employment, the difference between the two would be government employment at all levels. You can see it's pretty uniform, which tells you that government employment as a total has been pretty consistent. But you'll also notice this reference line here. This reference line is where the private sector employment was when the recession began. If you look over here, you'll notice that our current situation is lower than that. So we have, after this recovery, 15 quarters of recovery, we are still below where we were when the recovery began. So we're still below the peak. After 66 months, that's where we are now, 66 months of recovery, we're still below the peak level of employment when all this trouble started. And this little reference line here is representing 24 months. 24 months is when the employment recovers where it was at the previous peak, most of the time during recessions, during recovery. So you can see we are way below that, and we are way behind schedule on that. Here are some employment to population ratios for the three recoveries, 82, 75, and 92. You can see that by this point we were up 7% in 75. That's the ratio, employment to the adult population that could conceivably be employed. We're not counting children. We're not counting people institutionally confined. So we're up 5.3% in the 82 recovery. We're down 2% here. So the difference between, take that average maybe of 6, instead of being up 6, we're down 2. And so what that shrinkage in the employment to population ratio means, it translates into a loss of output of about $600 billion by this particular time. Let's talk about debt. That's another one of the things that the media talks a little bit about, but not much. The stagnant recovery is naturally going to make the national debt worse because you don't have as many tax revenues. Tax revenues are not growing as rapidly as they should. Government expenditures for transfer payments, such as unemployment compensation, etc., are rising. And so that pinches the government budget, creates deficits. Well, it doesn't create them, it exacerbates them. But I drew this chart from an interesting book that gave you some statistics that went all the way back to Alexander Hamilton. So it goes back to 1792. Here's 1792 right here. Well, right here is 1792. And you can see that for up until almost 1950, right around here's World War II. So here's your debt increase from World War II. Look at this thing. Somebody might say, well, I know, but it's not adjusted for inflation. It's not adjusted for inflation, that's true, because we don't have reliable price indexes that go that far back. And so there's no way to adjust it for inflation. So maybe you could say, well, if it was adjusted for inflation, it wouldn't look nearly as bad. I disagree. I think it would look terrible. I think it would really, really look bad. So you can see the growth rates here. The first 148 years of our existence, the debt grew at 4.3% a year. The next 66 years, it grew at 6.4% a year. Now, part of this time, most of this 148 years, this is a period in which we borrowed money to expand the purchase of land from foreign countries. We borrowed money to fight wars, to survive, and yet we paid those debts off through tax revenues. Now we're into the era here, this last part of the era, which is longer than 12 years. I just picked the last 12 years somewhat arbitrarily to show you what the growth rate is of over 9%. So that would double the national debt every 7.9 years. So for most of this time period, we're borrowing and paying off, repaying the debt. For the period of time starting around 1960 or so, we're borrowing, not paying the debt. We're basically paying the interest. So one of the things I wanted to ask you to think about is this. Every time somebody talks about how important a particular program is that the government is running, and many are important, we need to ask ourselves this question. Is it so important that we are willing to pay interest on 40 cents of every one of those dollars spent forever? Because since we no longer pay the debt off with tax revenues, we are basically refinancing the debt. We're doing exactly what the Europeans are struggling to do now, find buyers for the new debt so we can call in the old debt and give them some new debt, but we simply can't pay it off. And that is our situation right now. This is a shorter period of time starting at the end of World War II, where we had a tremendous amount of debt. The debt was 125% of GDP. We're up to 100% now, but not quite at that particular level. So if you used 1946 as a reference and used that national debt figure to represent 100, used 100 to represent that, we're up at 5,090. So it's higher by a factor of 59 just since the end of World War II. Now here's a calculation that I thought was kind of interesting. We hear people talk about the necessity of raising government expenditure. Recently we've been hearing it mostly from Austin, to account for population increase and inflation. So I thought, okay, what if we took the debt that existed in 1946, and we increased it for population growth and for inflation every year up to the present time, well, 2012. What would that give us? And I'm calling that the adjusted debt, okay, the blue line. So the national debt would be right around $4.5 trillion if it was increased for population growth and inflation. The difference between where it is and where it is now and where it would be if it was adjusted is what I'm calling excess here. So you can see that for a few years, right in here, about a 25-year period, the actual debt doesn't grow quite as fast as the adjusted debt. So I'm calling that area B. But for most of the chart, the actual debt grows much faster than it should have with just population and inflation. I'm calling that area A. So if you add the two areas together or subtract A from B, you get $11.6 trillion. So almost 75% of our debt is over and above what would be necessary to fund new programs to represent the growth in population and the higher cost of buying goods and services. This is called the baseline. Baseline federal spending. This came from Mr. Obama's 2013 budget. You know, on Wednesday he released the 2014 budget, and I want to tell you about that in just a minute. But this is the 2013 budget, and by looking at this picture, this one picture, you can help resolve some of the confusion that you may have felt about that. So we start over here at the at 2013, $3.8 trillion. That's the amount budgeted to be spent. Estimated revenues, $2.9 trillion. So that gives you a deficit of almost $1 trillion, right, in that 1 year. Okay, and you'll notice that the same gap runs for 10 years. So they're assuming that the economy will grow at 4.5% a year. What's the economy growing now?
Less than 1%.
Yeah, the latest report for the fourth quarter of 2012, that's the latest figure available, was minus 0.1%, which they then said, no, we've revised it, it's plus 0.1%. I was able to sleep much better after that. So you got 0.1%, and the assumption here was 4.5%. So we're going to be a little off here. Expenditures are going to be higher, revenues are going to be lower. What does that mean for the deficit? It's going to be bigger. What does that mean for the debt? It's going to grow faster. All that's in here. Now, so over a 10-year period, the Obama 2013 budget estimated total spending of $46.9 trillion. Now, you remember the sequester? The big fight we had over the sequester? What was the total reduction in spending over 10 years?
$82 billion.
Yeah, $82 billion. And notice this, the total spending, $46.9 trillion. Infinitesimally small. Projected deficit over 10 years, $6.6 trillion. This whole thing of baseline budgeting started in 1974. I thought I'd give you these two items in case you wanted to look them up for yourself. Very interesting reading. With the Budget Act of 1974, for the first time, Congress required a 5-year projection on any budget. Now we're up to 10 years, but the first bill was a requirement for a 5-year projection based on existing programs. In 1987, that was amended to include adjustments for inflation. So you have growth in programs, same program, but we're assuming more people in the programs, and then you have inflation tacked on top of that, and that's what gives you this steadily, smoothly increasing number here. Now, many people thought that with the continuing resolution, when that came up to fund the government, that the House would defund Obamacare. Very difficult to do. They apparently were unable to do that. But I wanted to give you at least one piece of good news this morning. Here is the piece of good news. This language, I'll read it in case you can't read it from where you are. The continuing resolution passed March the 6th has a paragraph in it that says, quote, "None of the funds appropriated by this act may be used for the procurement of ball and roller bearings other than those produced by a domestic source and of domestic origin." So that puts the quietus on any imported ball bearings. And so that, I know that's good news to you, but it does show you that Speaker Boehner and the boys were able to reach agreement on one very important issue. Here is a picture just of the spending, and I put this up here to illustrate the confusion that's been created by this process of baseline budgeting. So here you have the fiscal 2013 spending, $3.8 trillion. Each year it's projected to rise. And so this triangle right here represents increased expenditure that is built into the baseline. And so when you get to the end, if you computed the area of this triangle, you'd get $8.9 trillion. Now, suppose, let's say in this year right here, let's say that you spent an amount represented right up in here. The difference between that point and the line would be called an increase in spending, because it's higher than what was projected originally. Well, what if you didn't do that? What if you spent down here instead of up here? Well, if you spent down here, that would be called a cut. That's a cut in expenditure. And what confuses people, of course, is that this line represents where we were in 2013. And most people think a cut is spending less than you spent last year. Well, that's the magic of the baseline budgeting. I got a quote from you here for you here from an article that appeared this week, April the 9th, in the Wall Street Journal. It's called "A Primer for Understanding Obama's Budget." It's written by an economist. He is formerly president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Now listen to this. For 50 years or so, the federal government has deliberately and to an increasing extent misstated probable future budget deficits. Democrats and Republicans are guilty. The White House is guilty, and so is Congress. Private firms that deliberately misrepresent their financial statements in this fashion would be guilty of a crime. Now, how can Congress misrepresent these to come out to where it confuses us and understates the actual spending? He gives you an example. Congress enacts certain tax and spending measures as temporary, that's got quotes around it, when it has no intention of allowing the provision to lapse. So they identify a certain amount of spending as temporary so that the Congressional Budget Office will drop that out at the end of the temporary period. Maybe they tell them, assume it only lasts 2 years, but they intend it to last 10 years. Well, at the end of the 2 years, the CBO drops that out and makes expenditure projections look a little lower. They also assume legislative provisions in current law that would cut spending will be made when Congress knows they never will. So here's the point that I want you to understand, because the media uses the CBO estimate of what the budget would do in the future as though it were an unbiased, that's not the word I want, unbiased opinion, or a third-party opinion, disinterested opinion, that's better. But what he's telling you here is that the CBO receives the numbers, and they also have guidelines on how they are to interpret the numbers. And Congress, that is responsible for the spending, writes the guidelines. So basically, Congress, through the guidelines, is determining the result that the CBO will arrive at. It's a self-fulfilled prophecy. I thought you'd like to see a picture of the projected spending in the 2013 budget for the next 10 years versus the adjusted spending after the sequester. I thought that would make you feel much better to see how much has been cut as a result of that. So we have baseline spending, $46.9 trillion over the whole 10 years. The sequester cuts are 1.1 trillion over the whole thing. So net total spending is only going to rise by $45.8 trillion. This is the 2014 budget, the one that came out Wednesday. I love this statement. This was quoted by Fred Lucas on Cybercast News. Quote, "It's a budget that doesn't spend beyond our means." So I thought, first thing you need to do, Tim, you need to go to that budget. I'm looking at table S5 here, which gives you outlays and receipts and deficits. So I'm thinking, okay, if it's a budget that doesn't spend beyond our means, then we wouldn't have any more deficits. But I looked across this row here, and the highest deficit is $1 trillion. The lowest deficit is $500 billion. And the combined deficits for the next 10 years are $5.3 trillion. And those figures that are optimistic assume that taxes represent 20% of GDP. Most of the time they're 17 or 18, so there's a lot of assumed new tax revenue assumed there. They're assuming a growth in tax revenues of almost 8% a year. So what does that mean for us? Let me just give you two relative comparisons, okay? This is government debt, which we would call the national debt, as a percent of our GDP. Right now, we're up around 100%. Although you'll notice the media usually uses a figure in the 70s. That's because they're not counting debt held by government agencies. So all the debt that's held by the Federal Reserve, the obligations that the Treasury has for the securities that are in the so-called Treasury lockbox or fund, they don't count those. But if you counted them, we'd be around 100%. You'll notice the remarkable coincidence of these two lines. One representing Greece and one representing the United States. These are percentages now over here. So you can see Greece started out at about where we are now and then moved on up to around 160 or 170% of GDP. Now, the broken line here, the dashed line, is the guideline established by the EU. So basically they're saying, to be safe, thou shalt not exceed 60%. So you can read the chart as good as I can. The U.S. is now at 100. That's way in excess of the maximum debt ratio. And of course, so is Greece. They also have a chart showing the government budget deficit or surplus as a percent of GDP. This isn't the debt now. This is the annual deficit, the amount by which you spend more than you take in. And you can see that in a couple years right here, here's the zero line. So if you had a balanced budget, that you'd be on the zero line. So we got a couple years of surplus, and then we went on down into deficits. Greece never had any surpluses, but you notice the correspondence of these two lines around 2012. They're converging. The EU guideline for maximum deficit ratios is -3%. Here's a green reference line. It's negative because a deficit is a negative number. And so you can see that we are, as Greece is, way below the maximum floor, or we're above the criteria, if you want to look at it that way. Now, what are the conclusions here? Number one, real GDP remains below the pre-recession peak, $4 trillion in lost production. We talked about that. People continue to leave the labor force, which is not a sign that the public is optimistic. And in economics, things turn out pretty much the way people expect them to turn out. And that is why people's expectations, their psychology, is so very important. Number three, after 5 years of recession, employment remains below the pre-recession level. Number four, both Democrat and Republican budgets call for 10 more years of deficits. I just showed you the 2014 one from Mr. Obama. I didn't show you the one from Mr. Ryan. but he's got 10 years worth of deficits too. Number 5, U.S. budget status and debt ratios are on the same path as Greece. And number 6, baseline budgeting continues to obfuscate our true condition and create the illusion of federal budget cuts that are really increases. Now, if I hadn't run out of paper, I'd have number 7 on there. But I wrote it on the back of an envelope, so I'm going to read it to you. This is, I think, maybe the most important conclusion as far as looking forward. What do you think is going to happen in the future? Let me ask you a question before I tell you. What is it that caused the financial meltdown that began in 2008? Lending money to people who could not pay it back. Why did banks lend money to people who they knew could not pay it back? Why did they do it?
The government coerced.
Because the government put the heat on them to do so, to achieve some kind of equity, social, whatever, compassion objective. So here's a story from yesterday. It's about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created. That's created by the Dodd-Frank Act, Dodd-Frank bill. And that agency is endowed with the power to police all financial markets in the interest of ensuring that fairness takes place. Now, so you have some people appointed to be in the Bureau, and they have a director, Mr. Cordroy, but they also have a 25-member advisory committee. And so I thought I would just help you identify one of the people, just one of the people that's on this advisory committee. Her name is Ellen Seidman. As a top, I'm quoting now from this article, as a top Clinton bank regulator who enforced the Community Reinvestment Act. Does that ring a bell? Community Reinvestment Act? Mm-hmm. That's the act that empowered the Attorney General to put pressure on banks to lend in areas and to people that they would not normally lend to. She actually encouraged subprime lending in undeserved communities. Now here is an additional observation. Growth in the subprime credit market, this is what she said. Growth in the subprime credit market indicates that credit needs in many low and moderate income areas are being met. She said that in 1999. She also approved the relaxation of credit standards and the development of the subprime securities market. Subprime securities. You remember those were the bonds that crashed. Now, why is this important? It's important because with the advice of people like that, the Consumer Financial Protection Board has recently released new mortgage rules that require no minimum credit score or down payments, and even allow government assistance checks to qualify as your income. What are we doing here? We are laying the groundwork for another subprime mortgage collapse. And that is maybe one of the most ominous developments that I have seen so far. So that's the update. And I wish I had some really good news for you, but I don't. Are there any questions?
Yes. You didn't really think you'd get away, did you?
Am I on?
Yes.
What will be the effect when the Federal Reserve stops buying up the federal debt? And when are they likely to stop buying our debt?
Well, let's take the second part of the question first. How long do you have to do something that doesn't work before you fess up and say, you know, that doesn't work. I need to try something different. Does it take you a month? Does it take you 3 months? Does it take you 4 years? We've been doing this zero interest rate thing to stimulate the economy for 5 years. Now, you just looked at the first 2 or 3 charts. Is it working? No. How long will it take Mr. Bernanke to realize that it's not working? I don't know the answer to that. What? 4 more years. Well, I think this, my personal feeling, since you asked for my opinion, My personal feeling is that whereas he may have adopted this zero interest rate policy thinking it would stimulate the economy right at first, I think at some point he began to realize that even though that wasn't working, the zero interest rate policy was keeping the Treasury's interest payments low on the debt, just like they did at the end of World War II. They got into a deal where the Treasury asked the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low so they didn't have to pay out as much interest to finance the debt. And I think maybe that's what we've gotten ourselves into here.
Based on the facts, why is the stock market at an all-time high?
I have no idea. We were talking about that earlier at one of the tables. I have no... for a while, I think you could say that what was driving the market is the fact that interest rates on safe investments were so low that desperate people were going into the stock market even though the economy was uncertain and saying, hey, I'm willing to take a chance in the stock market because I'm not earning anything on my CDs. But at this particular point, after that many years, I don't really know what the explanation is.
Ratios are interesting. The count of employed is also interesting, but how much of the new jobs paid is even more so? How many people are part-time? And what is the wage rate doing?
Well, there's an increase in the number of people working part-time, and of course that is being exacerbated by the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which, as you know, has a certain cutoff line. If you have fewer than X number of employees, you don't have to go through the hassle of meeting all the provisions of this act. And so instead of hiring full-time people, they're hiring part-time people that are not counted. So that's part of the explanation. As far as the pay goes, the pay is not recovered, even though the average American worker produces output that is, if you rounded it, you could say $100,000. Now, that's not every worker. That's the average for all workers put together. So it helps you understand that when one person is not working on an average basis, we as a community are losing $100,000 worth of output each year. Whereas the same person on disability may be getting a check, he may be able to pay his bills, which may be okay with him, but you and I are doing without the output that he could be producing, and we are all therefore poorer as a result of that. I might also say that on some of these charts that we looked at, where you saw the 2013 and we spoke about the 2014 budget from Obama, one of the things he has been criticized for already is a proposal to change the cost of living formula for Social Security benefits. And so instead of using the old CPI technique that most economists agreed was a slight overstatement of inflation, he wants to use an alternative measure that was developed by the government economists called the Chained Cpi. And technically it is superior to the old method. It's not going to make much of a difference, but for somebody that counts every single dollar in their Social Security paycheck, it may be a significant thing for them. I would point out that there is nothing about switching from the old system to the new that will lower anybody's Social Security check. So that's kind of a red herring that's being thrown out there. It will simply slow down the rate of increase in the future in Social Security, but it's not going to cut anybody's check.
I have a request for some of the information you had on the screen.
Right.
Is it going to be available on our website, or can that person get your email and get it?
Well, I can send it to the person who handles the website. And if it's been taped successfully, I guess you could combine those two things, the charts with the picture.
Why is gold tanking?
I don't know the answer to that either.
What effect will this level of debt have in the stock market now and in the near future? And what advice would you give investors concerning being in the stock market in the years to come?
Let's take the second one first. I don't give investment advice, not to anybody. For many years, we were heavily invested. My wife did most of the investing. She was extremely successful at it. We talked it over, but she had a really good insight, and I realized that and took advantage of it. So I don't give investment advice. I would say this: there is something very unusual about our current situation. because if there were not something unusual about it, the matters that we have discussed would probably be producing a very anemic stock market instead of the one that we are seeing. So for some reason, there is a disconnect between the economic realities and what the stock market is seeing, and I don't fully understand that, the reason for that disconnect.
Are you familiar with economist Martin Anderson? I believe he states the stock market is going up because people in Europe are pulling money out of the EU and investing in the United States.
Well, that could be, and that may, you may have a circle here. I have wondered myself, what would our situation be? And you might play this what-if game on the way home. What would our situation be in America if none of the countries in Europe had a debt problem? What would our situation be? In other words, investors in the world could choose from EU bonds, euro-denominated bonds, for countries that were not overly extended, could pay their bills, had good credit ratings, or they could buy American debt when we have this 100% debt ratio in which the government and our own government has been downgraded by several of the credit rating agencies. Which would you buy? Where would you put your money? I put my money in euro bonds. So it could be that one of the reasons why we are not seeing dire consequences in the U.S. bond market now is that when you compare U.S. bonds to the devastation in Europe, we still look pretty good. So it's it's relevant. Everything's relevant for investment purposes. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate your attentiveness.
Let's give Dr. Kane a big hand.